Today, I'm joined by Simon Harrington, Head of Public Affairs at PIMFA. We're discussing whether simplified financial advice could help more people access what they need to live better financial lives without recreating the cost and complexity of full financial advice. Simon, welcome to Regulated Digital.
Thanks for having me on, Sam.
Thank you for taking the time. So let's start with the basics. We've heard about the advice gap for years. Is that still a problem? Is it a bigger problem than it's ever been? And what's still preventing people from the support that they need?
So I think there are a couple of questions here. To begin with, I think identifying what the advice gap is actually, I think, slightly more difficult than you would imagine. I mean, the obvious answer is the advice gap is, well, anybody who is not receiving financial advice. I think we know that it is a lot more sort of complicated by that. There are lots of people in this country who would benefit from a form of sort of support when they are making financial decisions, which you wouldn't necessarily consider to be representative of financial advice. Going backwards a little bit further, I think one of the sort of pressing issues that we currently have in this country and will continue to have, and it is an issue in that it is pressing, but it is also not necessarily negative, is that the way in which this country now engages with its finances has been subject to sort of significant amounts of change over the course of the last decade or so. And over the course of that decade, I think the issue of the advice gap, so to speak, has become more pressing. To that end, I think it's probably useful to reference the introduction of pension freedoms in 2015. In that, prior to 2015, we had a system where people would save into a pension either knowingly or unknowingly because of the introduction of automatic enrolment. But then because of compulsory annuitization, the decisions that they made at the point of retirement were sort of reasonably simple. Do I buy an annuity with my current provider or do I buy an annuity with someone else? Yeah. The vast majority of people, as we know, actually sort of stayed with their current provider. The end of compulsory annuitization has created a much more sort of complex landscape for savers who are sort of quite unprepared and quite financially unsophisticated to navigate those sort of reasonably complex choices, which, as I said, has sort of raised the spectrum of the advice gap, so to speak, in the UK. We know that less than sort of 10% of the UK population currently accesses financial advice in any form. Numbers range between sort of 4.7 and 4.9 million people. I think if you actually sort of dig into that, a lot of the people who are accessing financial advice are basically the sort of people that you would expect to be accessing it. Because I think if we look at sort of what's been driving the advice gap sort of more generally, it is quite difficult to sort of look away from the fact that advice is expensive. And it is expensive for firms to deliver. And in turn, that means it is expensive for individuals to pay for it. And for a lot of people, the cost is prohibitive to them. And for others, they look at the cost and they sort of see, well, actually, I would rather do this myself. And I think that's sort of one of the more kind of interesting things that you see when you sort of explore the advice gap. Yes, cost always sort of comes up as the primary issue why people don't want to access it. But the second issue always tends to be, well, actually, I think I can do it myself, be that either because of overconfidence or actually an absence of trust in the financial advice profession sort of more generally.
Yeah, or perhaps just a long-term kind of, as I'm not in the habit of having financial advice over the course of my life, at this point, when I have to make this decision, why would I now do that? Throughout my entire life, I've not had that access. I've not had that support, and I've been fine. There's also that kind of, we're quite risk averse as a culture in terms of investing. So you have a lot of money sitting in 0% cash accounts.
Yes.
So it's this kind of messy middle where there's a lot of money in the market or not in the market that these solutions are looking to address, or where perhaps the most value is in addressing. So how do we understand there's lots of solutions the FCA's brought out to address this? How do we understand the difference between all these terms, simplified advice, targeted support, and advice guidance boundary?
Okay, so I think it's probably worth sort of starting from the beginning. When the FCA launched its sort of consumer investment strategy in around sort of 2021, 2022, one of the things that it explicitly wanted to look at was the advice gap, which in turn sort of created this advice guidance boundary. review. And sort of one of the reasons we were able to look at it specifically was because of our departure from the European Union and the way in which personal recommendations are sort of set out within legislation. So it is sort of one of those sort of lesser seen Brexit benefits. The FCA and the Treasury sort of saw an opportunity to sort of remodel, I guess, what you would call the continuum support which we have across the landscape, because previously what we had was financial guidance, which was sort of very much kind of paint by numbers. This is what something is. This is what you could potentially do with it, but it couldn't tell you what you specifically could or should do. Now, the first step here was the introduction of targeted support, which, whilst I know this podcast is ostensibly about simplified advice, I don't think your listeners would take offense at me saying that I think targeted support is probably the sexier and potentially more impactful intervention for the mass market. But targeted support now represents a personalized recommendation where a financial services firm can tell you what you should do based on an understanding of your broad characteristics. This is a significant change from where we were previously, and it's a massive step up from guidance. I think what we will begin to see, apologies if I'm sort of burying the lead here a little bit, but I think what we will increasingly see is sort of large financial institutions having a much more sort of personal relationship with their clients and sort of nudging them and signposting them towards better financial sort of options relative to the ones that they are doing. So, Mr. Kendall, we noticed that you have £10,000 sitting in your bank account. People like you tend to buy a stocks and shares ISA, for example. That's a huge step change that has massive ramifications, I think, for the advice industry going forward, not in terms of their ability to offer targeted support, but maybe in terms of the wealthiness of their clients when they become available to. Now, as I said, targeted support is, I think, very much seen as a mass market offering, and I think we'll see it from larger, almost entirely from larger vertically integrated organizations. Now, what the FCA is currently consulting on is sort of sitting between targeted support and sort of holistic financial advice. As we currently see it, is simplified or limited scope advice. And the key change here is a lowering of the threshold within COBS, where firms are able to provide advice based not on information which is necessary, but information which is sufficient. So sufficient to a specific outcome. Now, the case study, which I think is sort of most useful in terms of sort of illustrating what limited scope is that a sort of client approaches a firm or an advisor with a stated need. So I have £50,000 to invest. What should I do? And what the FCA proposes here, or what the FCA envisages, is that in this scenario, a firm will be able to design a consumer duty aligned journey, which is stripped down relative to the one today, based entirely on the client's stated need through the collection of sufficient information, and then be able to personally recommend to them that the client, for example, put £20,000 into a stocks and shares ISA and puts £30,000 into a general investment account. I'm not a financial advisor. If that is bad advice, please don't sue me. It is envisaged that this will be simpler, it will be quicker, and as a result, it will be cheaper. And as a result, you would then expect more consumers to want to avail of it than is currently the case with respect to financial advice. You then obviously have holistic financial advice as we currently understand it. The FCA is doing some very welcome things there with respect to ongoing services. We know that 80% of revenues within the financial planning and wealth management community come from ongoing services. The fact that they are simplifying it, making it more flexible for firms is also sort of very welcome. But in general, the rules around it are not, the rules around the delivery of holistic financial planning are not changing substantially.
So we've talked about, from what you've talked about, they're not necessarily these forms of simplified advice digital in scope, but they afford methods of communicating that are much more, because due to their nature, they're more rigid, they're more based on sort of segmentation and can be based on freely available data or data that you might already hold as a provider. They enable these sorts of either inbound form journeys, streamlined journeys, perhaps that are catered more to your needs, as well as outbound nudges. Is that right? What kind of experiences can we expect from a consumer side? Can you paint that picture for us?
Okay, so I think, with respect to targeted support, you would expect firms already are designing specific targeted support journeys, which are based on the collection of information, right? So the consumer will go through, I guess you would call it, a very sort of stripped down fact find. The key difference, though, is that the fact find, and we shouldn't call it that, but I am for the purpose of this conversation, the fact find will be predicated on basically placing the consumer into a segment with a sort of outcome aligned to it, but the outcome will not be sort of uniquely personal to that one person. It will be uniquely personal to the segment. So
it might have your name on it, but it will be you are this kind of customer.
Exactly. So even though the FCA has sort of moved away from this language, I think quite unhelpfully actually, the recommendation that comes out will be people like you do this. So people like you put £15,000 into a stocks and shares ISA and put it into a balanced portfolio. Would you like to do it? And that will be the recommendation. It is envisaged that will be almost entirely digital. In fact, I think there are some firms who have looked at the delivery of targeted support who actually take the view that because of the risk of uncovering information which might potentially throw off that journey, it is too risky to basically deliver it in person. I think where simplified advice differs, and it is important to state that, this is still subject to consultation and there are lots of questions that firms still have around the delivery of it and specifically actually the journey into it. I think it is primarily envisaged that simplified advice will at least have some human oversight here and will look and feel a lot like financial advice as is currently delivered, but it should just be quicker and simpler and less regulatorily onerous, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So simplified advice will be more of a pre-packaged, pre-structured, more rigid route than you would typically get with holistic advice.
Indeed. I think, and maybe this is unhelpful, but I think the best way to look at it in comparison to holistic advice as we currently understand it is that simplified or limited scope advice will be sort of primarily a transactional tool. So I want to do this, or I think you should do this, and we can do this in a simplified way without having to take due consideration of all of your circumstances.
Got it. Okay. So that will likely be probably, if you're a wealth management firm, you'll be looking at a hybrid journey where you sort of collect that information at the start. And like you say, it kind of feels very much like holistic advice does these days in that way.
Yes, and I think there are, as I said, this is subject to consultation, but I think there are questions that we have about, sort of, for example, how you might be able to integrate that within your existing proposition. So let's say, for example, you have a client that you have been servicing on a full holistic basis for 15 years. You know everything about them. You know that their sort of circumstances haven't changed, but they want to do, for example, a pension top up, for example. Is there a world in which you can actually do that on a simplified basis without having to sort of reassess suitability, et cetera, et cetera? So there are sort of, I think, some quite interesting questions around how firms might be able to integrate it within their existing propositions rather than necessarily looking at it as a sort of singular proposition in and of itself.
So the danger there is, if it looks like holistic advice and it feels like holistic advice, how do we maintain trust by being transparent about what we're providing as a service?
So I think, and again, subject to consultation, very difficult to sort of know if there'll be disclosure requirements associated to it. I think we strongly believe that there should be. But the key challenge for firms that want to adopt this and maybe sort of roll out specific kind of limited scope, simplified propositions. And I do think at this point, it's important to stress that whilst we think this is a sort of very interesting and important intervention, we don't think it's necessarily going to sort of change the world, and we certainly don't think that we're going to sort of move into a world in which it sort of becomes the primary way in which sort of people access financial advice. We think it's a sort of potential opportunity for sort of retail banks and sort of insurers in particular to maybe re-enter the market in some form in order to help close the advice gap. But ultimately, I think it's going to have to sort of rely on the way in which the firm discloses the nature of the service to the individual, and in particular, the nature of what it is not. So this is a thing that I am going to do for you based on my assessment of your needs. I think that we can do this in a simplified rather than a holistic way. With that, there are sort of benefits to you, specifically cost, but there are also potential things that you miss out on, which you will have to weigh up as a consumer. And again, without sort of having full oversight of what the FCA envisages good and bad practice to be in this area, we are sort of very much in the realms of kind of speculating on sort of what that looks like. What I would say is that I don't necessarily think that trust is a particular concern for us here. I think were I a firm considering offering this as a sort of primary part of my proposition, and again, this actually goes to targeted support as well. One of the reasons why we don't think it's going to be of much interest or any interest at all to advice firms is the question of whether or not you consider it sort of represents an undermining of your own proposition. And actually, you feel that, let's say, for example, you're a two advice firm, you both look after 130 clients each. Do you feel that you can actually sort of service those clients well with your current proposition? You don't actually have to sort of expand out and offer this thing.
Yeah, I mean, that there is on the other hand, people have said, well, this will be an introduction to holistic advice, like an on-ramp to holistic advice. And it could be, I mean, that kind of, you can see how it could be used as a kind of lead generation tool almost, where you sort of have this introduction to advice. And then, okay, if there are complexities, you ask particular questions during that process, and then you almost upsell. I hate the word upsell, but almost you would upsell them to the holistic experience.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the right way to look at it. I think where we sort of initially see opportunities here is obviously with trainees as well for firms, but also actually the intergenerational planning piece. So, how do you sort of help service clients, the children of clients, especially those who, without wanting to use acronyms, Henrys, et cetera, this is a way for you to do that. And this is a way for you to get them into the firm early and service them in a sort of reasonably a cost-effective manner in a way that you currently sort of are sort of prevented from doing.
And in terms of the practical rollout of this, I'm a firm, maybe a mid-sized firm. I want to start putting together a package for simplified advice. Is it commercially viable? How much is it going to cost me to do this? Not in terms of my existing base and eating into that, but in terms of the resource needed to put something like this together that is in line with the regulation.
Okay, so I think the question of commercial viability is the $1 million question here, in that I think our own assessment of it is that if you were a firm running this as a proposition in and of itself, the commercials might be quite difficult, especially with the fact that sort of the cost of compliance, et cetera, will still be there. We know that that's sort of one of the largest barriers to firms sort of offering, current advice at a sort of more affordable, at a more affordable price. We know the margins in this industry are sort of tough more generally. As a result, I think it does need to be looked at sort of not as a side of the desk thing, but as an additional string to a firm's bow if they were sort of wanting to sort of offer this. As I said, I think the big kind of commercial opportunity with respect to simplified advice are firms that are sort of already operating at scale, and firms that might want to re-enter the market. Sort of looking ahead, I think if I'm a sort of mid-sized firm, or actually if I'm sort of a smaller boutique firm, I would maybe sort of look at how the market is segmenting itself and whether or not some of the larger players in the market are sort of increasingly going to be sort of taking the mass market, and whether or not my proposition would be better suited sort of really kind of leaning into and sort of servicing kind of those high need planning clients, if that makes sense. And I think that's actually quite a big market opportunity for these sort of firms.
What has the initial feedback been from your side, from these sort of larger firms and consolidators who will be the kind of the first people to really roll this out at some scale?
So I think the initial feedback here is like, we're interested, but we have lots of questions. And I think the primary questions that we have here are, well, actually, what does the journey look like? So at the beginning of our conversation, I sort of said, person approaches a firm and says, I have £50,000 to invest. We know that that conversation rarely happens, right? We know that it is kind of very rare that somebody knocks on the door of an advice firm and says, I know exactly what it is that I want to do. Now, because of something like targeted support, those conversations might become more frequent. But I think it's also the case that, even when people sort of know what they want to do, one of the things that often happens during the advice journey is that the advisor sort of uncovers sort of other needs or wants or things that sort of weren't surfaced in the initial conversation. So I think the primary kind of question that we have is, well, what does a journey towards somebody saying, I need or I want a simplified advice service look like? Because I think you could, and some firms have sort of made this observation, I think we agree with that. I think you could sort of very obviously make the observation that the only way to actually identify that someone would benefit from simplified advice or limited scope advice, whatever it is the FCA is calling it, is to go through a full fact find, as is currently the case, which in turn sort of basically obviates the entire point of the delivery of limited scope
because
advice.
you've then got someone on the route to bespoke
Precisely.
holistic advice, and you're saying, actually,
Yes.
don't do this, take this cheaper option.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I've actually already incurred all of the resource cost of sort of doing the first thing, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. So then there's a question again of, well, to what extent can you use existing data that you hold on clients? And we think that that's a very obvious way to go about this. I think the kind of very real second question that we have on simplified advice or limited scope advice is, what happens if the client says, well, actually, why didn't you ask me this? And like all of these, and like every single sort of regulatory intervention which sort of tries to sort of expand access, I think this basically comes down to how the FOS is going to interpret claims related to the limited scope advice. Why didn't you ask this question? How robust is your journey? Why were you confident that they would benefit from limited scope advice? And I think without those questions being answered, firms will be quite reticent to offer it and rely on their existing propositions, at least firms in the advice and wealth planning space.
It sounds simple, but can quickly unravel into complexity. And something that we can't help but talk about in every podcast is AI. I'm sorry. Automated decision making. AI can sort of take data, existing data, interact with clients in a limited capacity and sort of put all that data together and perhaps make a decision about whether you need simplified advice or not. Where can these digital tools help? Will they help or not?
So I actually think that there's a very strong argument to suggest that properly regulated and overseen AI could potentially be more impactful for the delivery of simplified advice rather than targeted support, provided that the parameters designed by the firm that offers it are sort of very kind of strict and obviously sort of overseen by a human. But I do actually believe that firms that want to roll out simplified advice at scale will do so basically through the use of AI. There will need to be a human element there, because I think if you look at human beings' willingness to engage in financial services decisions with respect to AI, I think recent YouGov polling had it at about 19%. There will need to be a hybrid element here, in that sort of at least an initial conversation will have to be overseen with a human being. But I think the way in which you do roll this out in scale potentially is actually through AI enabled models.
I suppose then the question is, if I interact with this AI every day for everything else in my life, if I've got my personal AI agent and I am a Henry, or,
Yes,
I'm of that sort of inclination tech enabled, then why am I going to a very specific separate AI tool to ask a different question of an agent that might not have all the information about my lifestyle? And, these are not immediate questions, not a concern right now, but you can see how that could be, how do we gain adoption of these things in 5 years' time?
I was about to sort of be over dramatic and say that what you've just identified is one of the things that keep me up at night, but I actually sleep like a baby. So I think there are two things to raise there. I think the first, and they might sort of seem as if they're in conflict with one another. I think the first point to raise is that I think one of the things that we know about financial services and the way in which people interact with it is that it lags behind the way in which people interact with other things, right? Financial services and the way that people interact with it is a sort of uniquely emotional thing. We have an investment problem in this country. We have sort of, 430 billion pounds sitting in cash at the moment, which could potentially be invested. And we know that people aren't doing it because they are sort of emotionally unwilling to sort of make that investment decision. And, the government and the regulator are doing a lot of things around that, and obviously targeted support and simplified advice is part of that. The sort of keep me awake at night question, I think, is really interesting because actually it's a perimeter question for the government and the regulator going forward. Because you're right, people interact with AI every day for their sort of everyday things. Why wouldn't they sort of start making financial decisions based on sort of what an AI agent tells them to do? And I think where we have concerns here is the extent to which those AI agents will sort of start providing individuals with recommendations which are not appropriately caveated, which do not sit within the regulatory perimeter, because it is just impossible for, the Financial Conduct Authority to regulate big tech in the way that maybe we would all want them to. And, are they even the right regulator to do that? And then the question becomes, well, what happens if when something goes wrong? Does that have a broader impact on trust in financial services more generally? Does it have a broader impact on people's trust in AI-delivered financial services when that AI is built specifically by financial services, well-regulated firms? And I think that is a genuine sort of public policy and regulatory problem that we have going forward. And I don't think anyone really has the answer to it.
Or is it just something that becomes sort of part of financial education? If you know that if you're dealing with your own AI or not with a regulated AI, then there's no recourse if something goes wrong. A lot of mistakes would have to happen for that to be public knowledge before people are educated on that.
But again, I think then there's a broader question of like, to what extent are people willing to accept that? Are people willing to accept that, yes, I will trade on a caveat emptor basis? And I think the reality is probably not. My first job was in pensions. Just after the financial services crisis, we were doing the financial crisis of 2008. We were doing research around people's willingness to participate in pensions. So this is in 2010, 2011. And overwhelmingly, those that did not were sort of raising the name of Robert Maxwell from, the 1980s. People have sort of very long memories, and it impacts on their sort of willingness to sort of engage with financial services products in particular. And I think the concern would be is, to what extent would that have a sort of significant impact on people's sort of willingness to sort of participate in the way that we would like them to do.
To not end the podcast with the tech gloom and doom that tends to end podcasts these days, to be positive, if these reforms, which are going in a positive direction, work a couple years' time, what would you hope to be the situation for me as a consumer?
So I think we have to be realistic about how impactful all of these reforms will be, in that, especially for the next few years, it is going to be slow burn. But I think the primary sort of indicator of this is working will be that people are engaging with their finances in a way that they currently are not. I think sort of the lazy indicator would be fewer people have cash within their ISAs or their current accounts. I think if you look at sort of the broader macroeconomic sort of outlook and current global affairs, like I think that's probably unlikely. This is an unfortunate time to be sort of launching a sort of large investment campaign, for example, across the UK. But ultimately, I think the indicator that we're going to be looking for is people engaging in the way that they currently are. So people at least exploring their options, people being more prepared for the decisions which they are confronted with at the point at which they retire, people making slightly more informed decisions than they currently are. And that might actually just sort of manifest itself in people shopping around in a way in which they currently aren't when they, for example, go to buy a drawdown account. People sort of moving providers. And I think that is the first sort of indicator that we will be looking at, that sort of level of consumer confidence, rather than sort of getting more people investing, better consumer outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. The extent to which people are engaging in a way that I think it's fair to say they currently are not, because, the vast majority of people accumulate the vast majority of their wealth through private pensions. The way in which our private pension system is engineered means that you benefit from basically not engaging with it at all. This obviously presents a problem when you have to when you do have to engage with it. So I think that sort of level of increased engagement, increased confidence is sort of really the first thing that we're looking for. And then hopefully over time, that will manifest itself into a sort of broader appetite to invest, to take more financial risk, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a long burn. It's not going to be something that sort of changes overnight. We're talking 10, 15 years.
Yeah. And in terms of changing culture and attitudes, a lot of these things we have to remember have an aggregate effect. There are lots of change, pension dashboard coming,
Yes.
smart data, lots of things bringing us closer to our finances in more digital ways, perhaps ways that we might prefer to interact with them these days, making them more available to us. You would hope on aggregate that increases confidence. The question of, whether we start to see cash moving out of people's accounts, and whether in economic terms, hopes for growth that will go into the UK or elsewhere. So there are larger questions around that.
Yeah, I think so.
And we won't address them today.
We have a new chancellor starting work on Monday, so that'll be an interesting sort of problem statement within their intro.
For now, thank you so much for joining us, Simon Harrington, PIMFA. Would you like to drop a website link or your email address for people to get in touch?
Sure. So if you are a wealth or financial planning firm, you want to hear more about PIMFA, please contact me at simonh@PIMFA, PIMFA, or you can access our website, which is www.pimfa.co.uk.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for now, Simon.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me.